And depending on where you're located, I'm going to say good morning and afternoon and good afternoon to everyone. And welcome to today's webinar. It's called Uncovering Blind Spots, the Power of a Proactive HR Audit. We're thrilled to have you guys join us today because we want to dive into the most important, yet I think, some people would agree that it's often overlooked. So especially in the area of organizational success. So we want to think about identifying and addressing, blind spots in the HR practices. My name is Becky Page, and I'm Director of HR Services for the JER HR Group. And I will kind of serve as the MC today. So Christy, if you want to go to the next slide.
Let's see, I lost my slides. There we go. All right.
Awesome. Well, it's with great pleasure that I introduce Christy Anderson. She's a senior HR consultant with the JER HR Group as our speaker today. Christy has 30 years plus experience with a significant amount in California, which most everybody on this webinar knows a high HR compliance state. She's worked in industries such as food, home building, and agriculture, just to name a few. Throughout her career, she has leveraged her extensive HR experience to focus on risk mitigation, assessing potential challenges, and guiding clients and teams toward the most effective management strategies. Coupled with her professional experience, she holds a professional human resource certification from the Human Resource Certification Institute. Before we get started, there are some housekeeping things we need to talk about. So this webinar is pre-approved, you'll see on the slide there, for 1 hour of SHRM and HRCI recertification credit. The certification credit and code will be included in the post-webinar email sent within 40 hours of the webinar completion. So you'll receive everything in that email. Also, we really want to extend our sincere gratitude to the Tennessee SHRM chapter for collaborating with us on this webinar. While we had over 40 states register for this webinar, we want to give a special shout out to the Tennessee SHRM participants for their strong representation today. Also, for questions and answers, in this particular webinar, we're going to reserve them to the end of the presentation, but feel free to enter your questions. We're going to use the chat feature, not the Q&A feature, and we'll strive to get to many as soon as we can at the end of the presentation. And I don't know how many more people have just joined recently, but I know a lot of people ask. You will, just a quick reminder, you will receive an email with all the webinar information, including the certification code. So I will see you later on in the presentation. And without further ado, I'm going to turn off my my video, and I'm going to turn it over to Christy Anderson.
All right. Thank you, Becky, for kicking us off. I appreciate that introduction. I am going to be talking about the power of uncovering blind spots in a proactive HR audit for you today. We are going to go over the agenda. Really, what is an audit? What's covered or what should be covered in an audit? What are the objectives? What's the process? Our timing, and then the dual benefits, things, from the legal compliance to the employee relations side, helping to make it actionable by building a report that you can use to kind of give yourself a roadmap, helping you to mitigate risks, developing that action plan, and then overall a summary. And then, of course, we're going to give a little overview of JER and Trainery One, our company, and our contact information. So that is our agenda for today. We're going to jump right in with what is an HR audit. And an HR audit is essentially a comprehensive, objective overview or examination of our policies, our procedures, and it's going to help your team to drive organizational success and compliance. With this, we're going to look at key objectives and the value of conducting an HR audit. With that, systematically, where we're going to review HR policies, procedures, and practices, and the techniques for compiling those findings into actionable HR audit reports. So why should you conduct an HR audit? I'm a firm believer in what you measure is what you manage. So if we're going to conduct an audit, we're going to measure what we're doing well, where we have strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and how we can work through that to essentially give ourselves a guideline to make things better if we have those weaknesses, those opportunities, or those threats, and then to lean into our strengths. We want to make sure we're doing that as well. While we conduct the audit, we are going to be looking at the effectiveness overall of the HR department, the implementation and application of our HR policies and procedures. We are going to look into the reasons for things like low productivity and determine how to improve our HRD strategies. We're going to evaluate our HR staff and employees. And with that, we're going to look at things like, are these the right positions that I need to accomplish my goals for the HR department? Are these the right tasks that are assigned to the right people? We're going to review and or modify our HR systems and address challenges we find within that HRIS system. We're going to, through that process of an HR audit, constantly be in what I think of as a questioning mindset. So we're going to be seeking to understand, why did this happen? What is driving this to happen? What caused it to happen? And as we start asking those questions, we're becoming more objective and getting out of this is our process, this is why we do this is how we do this. Instead, we're looking at, is this working? How is this going to benefit the company and the organization? And let me advance here. So what are the objectives of an audit? We're going to evaluate compliance with our laws, so that legal compliance piece. We're going to assess our HR policies effectiveness, ensure accurate employee classifications and compensation, so the FLSA. We're going to look at gaps in training and development. We're going to check on things like our workplace culture and our safety, and we're going to provide actionable recommendations. We are going to help to identify gaps between the current state of our HR department and what our standard is and how we can streamline our HR work and processes. We'll encourage greater responsibility and professionalism among our HR team, and we're going to clarify HR duties and responsibilities. I always think in terms of when I started back in HR, we were kind of thought of as just party planners, and sometimes companies still think of us as party planners. And how do we get out of that mindset if we're with an organization that views us this way? So our audit tools helps to show that we can do so much more for the organization and the value that we can bring. And with that, it's our policies and procedures. So we're going to look at our policies and procedures, and we're going to look at things like, are we applying them consistently? And when we're reviewing those, if we're seeing gaps in that consistency, we're going to question, why are we not applying them consistently? What caused us to deviate from what we put down as our policy? Do we need to update our policy? Do we need to change it because that inconsistent application calls out to us that maybe this policy is outdated and it needs to be revised and updated to reflect whatever that change has been that's driven that inconsistent application of our policy? So that's a piece of an objective of that HR audit. We're going to look at our compliance with legal requirements. And I used a simple one here, but are our posters up to date and posted in a place for the employees to view them? Do we have an updated employee handbook that is legally compliant with our state laws? Or if we are a multi-state organization, are we having more than one handbook? Or do we lean into choosing to be compliant in one handbook by leaning into our highest, if you would, benefit level that we provide to our employees? Meaning that if in California, we have to do job position postings with wages. But in South Carolina, we do not have to do that. Are we going to make it our policy that across the board we're going to post our job descriptions with wage compliance? And that's just a simple one, but calling out how are we doing that? Why are we doing that? And are we leaning into that highest compliance state to give us our guidelines for our handbook? So that's the legal requirements portion. We're going to look at our HR costs. Do we have opportunities to reduce costs? And you can do some of this by shifting tasks, potentially automating tasks, removing tasks from our team. If it's not a true HR function, because sometimes we absorb things within HR, do we need to say this needs to go back to a different department? Are we being redundant or inefficient with our tasks? And I use an example here. If we're doing new hire orientation and we have one person conduct it, another process the paperwork, and another enter the new hire wages and the reporting into the system, would this be effective? Is this efficient to have three people touch the same thing? And are we potentially wasting time and energy by using this approach? So, would we be able to potentially improve this by measuring the time it takes each employee to perform their portion of that task? And then, if we had one person perform the task, what are the differences in that time? So, is it a true time saving? Does it become more effective, more efficient? And then we would document and determine what we would implement. We are going to also review our HR information systems. So, say we're using Gusto. Do we know how to use it effectively? If we onboard a new employee, do we struggle to input that new hire and get their first payroll processed? Are we not sure how to input it? If we are, why are we struggling? Is it the system? Are we trained in the system? Is this tool effective to meet the needs of our organization? So this is that questioning mindset. Is this right for what we're trying to accomplish? Does it meet the needs of what we're trying to accomplish? Do we need help to set up, say, new tax codes? Do we have the right partners to help us meet these tasks? We evaluate our system and our process to ensure we're being legally compliant, but also we're being effective with our time and our resources. So to me, these are the things that become the objectives of our HR audit. Okay. When it comes to an HR audit process, we are going to use 6 steps to help us stay on task. Scope and objectives. We really want to define what our scope is. What are we going to look at? What is our overall objective? The next step we go into is the gathering the data and reviewing the information for that scope. We're going to then go into assessing compliance and identifying our gaps, evaluating alignment with our organizational goals. So, does this meet what I'm trying to drive for the organization and for the HR department? And then we're going to develop recommendations for improvement and implement and monitor those changes. So, scope and objectives during this process is really where we plan our path forward for our HR department. So, as an example, we'll start with reviewing, and I just throw in here as staffing as one. This section would include our recruiting statistics, our turnover rates. Are we meeting our time to hire? Do we have, tons of vacancies? And in this section, we're going to plan out that scope. How much of recruiting are we going to look at under this umbrella? And we would do that for each of our areas within HR. What are we, looking at, and how are we going to define what it looks like? During the next step in our HR audit process, we're going to gather and review our information. And again, leaning into the recruiting side of things, as an example, we would be pulling our data, our metrics that would support what we've been doing in recruiting. And this could be our turnover reports, our hiring numbers, how many vacancies do we have, our time to fill reports. And if we don't have those reports, this would be a time to develop those reports and determine how are we going to sustain that going forward, because this becomes critical for us as we try to implement changes. Step 3 in our process would be assess compliance and identify gaps. So through this process, we're going to review those data, those metrics, those reports, and we're going to determine where are we meeting expectations within our HR department, where are we having our gaps and our inefficiencies. So when we see those gaps and inefficiencies, those become an area we may put on a list to target to drive an improvement. I would also like to do a list of here's where we're really performing well, because we want to make sure we're recognizing our team, and we're also calling out to our partners, hey, this is what we're doing. It's our time to kind of toot our own horn, if you would. We are then going into step 4, evaluating alignment with our organizational goals. We're really going to be looking at where are we driving our organization and our HR department against our findings. If we're having those gaps, where do we need to lean in to make sure we're meeting those objectives for the organization, and determine our course corrections. Step 5 in this process is developing recommendations. Once we have completed our analysis of each of our planned areas within our audit, we'll then complete an overall report, and it will have all of our findings. Let's say we use recruiting again. Our turnover metrics show we're at a 50% turnover from last year, a really high number. And through the process of our audit, we use tools like conducting interviews, review the data. We are now seeing that we're struggling with an effective onboarding and training process because of those interviews, those, let's say, exit interviews, the feedback that we're receiving, the reports that we're getting. And we see that that's our gap. Well, we report out that this is the gap in our process from our findings, and we make a recommendation on how to move forward to correct the gap. And then we implement the changes. So step 6 in this process is implementing changes. And with that, we would monitor our progress of anything that we implement. I view this as a very critical step. Once we implement the change, we need to follow up and monitor that what we have put in place is actually driving the change or the improvements that we had hoped would happen. And if it is not, we're not meeting that, then why not? We would review it and determine if we need to tweak something, make a correction to drive an efficiency. And for implementation, we would need to partner to develop meaningful changes for our teammates. And so, I always think of our partners in our organization, if it's operations, if it's accounting, if it's finance, whoever you're working with, those are our internal customers and our internal process partners, I'm sorry, not process, that we want to make sure that we're meeting whatever it is they have an expectation of for our HR team and our practices. So making sure we're having that communication and that check-in to make sure we're being effective. And next we have our first of 2 poll questions that are built into this. And so the poll question here is, how often should you conduct an HR audit? And your choices for response here are every quarter, every 6 months, annually, or just randomly whenever you want to put one into place. And so I'd ask if you all would take a minute or two to put in your response, and then we'll review those responses. Okay, so it seems like we have some people that the poll is potentially not working for and others that it is working for. Sanchita, I don't know if you can confirm if it is working or not.
It is working. I have like around 80% who have answered it. So it might have been a separate pop-up which um being disabled in a particular computer. So that might be the reason. But I think we have majority of people voting in. So I'm
Okay,
going to keep
perfect.
the answer on for another 2-3 seconds. We have kept it on for 2 minutes. I'm going to end it. Now we have, yeah, I think you should be able to see the results.
I can see the results now. Thank you, Sanchita. And so for our question here, we came in, it looks like with 65% saying annually, 16% saying every quarter, 14% saying every 6 months, and then 4% saying randomly. I would recommend annually because we'll get into that on the next slide, but the randomly becomes a potential as well. And this would be more in the event that you're responding to something that's happening within the organization that you would lean into this. So thank you all for taking the few minutes there to provide those responses. Right. And so next we go into timing of the audit. And as I mentioned, we would really lean into it is best to do an audit once each year because if you conduct it regularly, it becomes, I would say, a fairly managed process. So it makes it easier. You've built in your reports, your analysis, your data that you need to pull. So you're not having to do that on the front end once it becomes regular. And so it becomes more effective and also streamlines how long it takes you potentially to do it. And again, you may want to conduct them at other times, such as if you're going through like a merger or an acquisition, you have huge changes in your hiring. You don't normally hire at all, and now this year you're going to hire 100 people. You may want to look at, what's driving that. What are then the goals of the organization and HR? And do we need to do something different for our strategies because of that change? This would come into play even like if you had a reduction in force, you're having major issues with compliance, FLSA issues, you may want to, do that more on that, like I said, randomly side of things. Okay. So that's the timing of the audit. And wanted to call out some things that I view as benefits, maybe those softer side of the benefits types of things. And that would be EEOC and employee relations. Again, we're really driving to mitigate those risks from the compliance side of things. And then the employee relations side is the trying to enhance our overall organizational performance and potentially, making our employees happy to be a part of our organization. And so this, I have down some things in terms of 2024 EEOC statistics, and workplace discrimination charges. There were 73,485 charges of workplace discrimination in 2024, which is a 5% increase from the fiscal year 2023. So I think we're seeing that the EEOC is leaning a little bit more into this, or had been. Now with new leadership, we don't know what that'll look like, but it had been trending that way. So it was a watch out for me. With that, the monetary relief for victims was roughly 400 million. And this is for anyone who is employment discrimination through administrative enforcement and litigation efforts. There were 110 employment discrimination lawsuits focusing on emerging issues and underserved and or vulnerable populations. And with that, back wages and damages awarded through the EEOC was quite a lot of money. And that was only for 4,304 individuals, roughly $9,300 per person. So I view this as it's something that the EEOC is committed to enforcing those laws to prohibit employee discrimination and to really getting the remedies for their affected workers. And so as an employer, we want to make sure we're wearing that compliance hat to try and avoid having that exposure for our company and our team. And then we go into the employee relations side. And so I see this also as important because we want to make sure our employees are wanting to stay with us, right? That they feel engaged, that they're part of a team, that, you know, they feel recognized, they have a voice. And so with this, if we're doing these things well, employees with a positive experience are 68% less likely to consider leaving, and this is according to SHRM. You're going to have not engaged or actively disengaged employees. Those employees cost you about 1.9 trillion in lost productivity, according to Gallup. And our HR processes can reduce administrative workload by up to 40%, allowing us to focus more on strategic initiatives, which then could potentially make your own team happier because they're getting to work on things besides just that admin work. All right, and we now have our second poll question. And this is, what is the most significant challenge your organization faces in maintaining HR compliance? Keeping up with legal changes, training and awareness, resource allocation, or something else? And Sanchita is going to kick this off, and I'm imagining we may have this one do that same pop-out thing as it did last time. So if you all would take a few minutes here to respond, and then we'll go over the results of the poll.
Okay, we have around 80% who have participated. I'm going to end the poll and share the results.
Thank you, Sanchita. All right. And so here it looks like we're coming in with 47% saying training and awareness, 29 keeping up with the legal changes, 18 with resource allocation, and 6% other. I'm curious on those who answered other, if you wouldn't mind maybe putting it in the chat what you view as some of those others. For me personally, when it comes to this, I, having worked 30 years in California, it was always legal changes as my number one, because in California it was constantly changing. And so trying to make sure you're staying compliant. Are we meeting the PAGA laws? Are we making sure what's on our paycheck stubs is in compliance? So it was constant, the legal changes. And then for me, second would have been training and awareness, making sure that my team knew what we needed to focus on, making sure that we were trained to um, meet those expectations. And then potentially I had down that resource allocation as well if we didn't have the right staffing for our group. So I had that down. And I also would say now, being in a consultant role and working with clients who are different sizes, different focuses on, what their organization does, be it a nonprofit, be it a small manufacturing company, it's constantly changing. And I think a lot of what I see now is probably that training and awareness and resources. Um, some of the companies don't have HR teams, and so how are they actually meeting that HR work? They're partnering potentially with JER, but if you're not there on site, somebody on site is having to do that work. So how do you get that done, right? Um, and looking here in the chat, it looks like we have some people who um, they may be in that exact situation. I'm new in my ED role and I haven't experienced it yet. Um, so, sometimes companies set their own minimum wage, which could be something to check regularly for internal compliance. Absolutely. You want to make sure that if they're setting that it's still in compliance, especially with, say, last year where they were talking about the overtime thresholds changing for the FLSA. You could potentially become quickly out of compliance if you have something set as a baseline and that changes what it needs to be. Someone else saying that the company has multiple mergers and acquisitions with different policies and practices. Oh yeah, absolutely. I can feel you, Susan, here on getting them all aligned would be a huge challenge to ensure what the priorities are. And I think employees that come from different groups, this was our priorities here. On the other group, potentially their priorities were over here and they're not aligned. So how do you decide which one's going to be your driving force for the organization overall as we come together? Tracking expiring documents for all employees, licenses, insurances, etc., and working in hospice, I can see that as well. And this is where hopefully you have some HRIS tools that help you. And if not, maybe looking at what you can do to make things more streamlined. And then I selected other due to remaining up to date with ongoing operational changes, especially with many companies undergoing mergers and acquisition. Absolutely. And how do you define who's gonna have the precedent, if you would, from one side of an organization to another? Nonprofit childcare services, tracking various trainings, reports. Again, this one I think goes into if you have an HRIS system and you have an L&D piece, does it give you the tools and the capabilities to help you track those trainings? And if not, do you want to look at, is there something there out there that could help you meet that and make it easier for your team? So yeah, all of those challenges, I think for us in HR become which one's priority and how do we juggle and go forward from there. So thank you all for sharing. I really appreciate your input. All right. So we're going to go into findings and report. And as you begin to pull your data together, you're going to hopefully have a report template. If you don't have a template and you want one, I can certainly help anyone who wants one to put one together. With it, we're going to want to pull together our key findings and our gaps, again, those strengths, those weaknesses, and our risk areas. We want to make sure that we do call out anything that's working well. I know I said this earlier, but I think sometimes we forget to lean into the positives, and I view this as something that it's a great opportunity to give recognition to our team. We're killing it over here, guys. Keep this up and make sure that we don't slack in this area because we're now focused on these other areas, right? we want to, in that report, add a summary of our recommended improvements. And you would want to do this in priority order. So let's say something is a compliance issue. And with the compliance issue, we're totally out of compliance. We may have, some gaps and some ramifications from those that we might need to put things into place. That would become, for me, my priority number one. And if we had another where it was just, say, a time savings, that would likely be our lowest number on our list, right? When we're putting these findings and these reports together, we want to make sure we're using charts to help provide clarity if needed, anything that can help, for those visual people or those numbers people to help call out what we're doing, why we're doing it, why there's a need for this change. And then as you're doing those findings, you're going to want to make sure, you're putting things into place for monitoring your changes. So if you're starting to do the development of how are we going to navigate the change, we want to make sure we're monitoring the change as well. And let's see, we're going to go to our next slide. The action plan here. This one is looking at that initial audit, identifying our gaps, prioritizing those issues, developing our corrective action plans, implementing our updates and training our staff, and scheduling follow-up audits. So with this, looking at short-term actions, compliance issues, training of staff, long-term, developing your compliance calendar, updating your policies. So do we develop a calendar to review, however many policies a month? If we have 30 policies, do we do so many each month so it's not overwhelming for our team to have to do 30 at one time? So we build a calendar that helps us to stay on track with those things. We want to build resilience by establishing internal audits, timing, and practice. If we make something regular, it makes it so much easier to conduct and to build in our measurements, which make it easier to manage each year. It helps us to build accountability and to build training as needed for each area. So if we're going through this and our action plans say that, we don't do well when it comes to employee engagement, and then are we going to look at, we're going to develop roundtables that we'll conduct with so much of our population each month. And in that roundtable, we're going to have the HR manager and our executive director or CEO, whoever, would represent from the leadership side, to have those face-to-face meetings with our employees to really start building that employee engagement and that employee relations and having two-way conversation with our team. So would that be something we would look at as an outcome from this if we saw that was an area we were struggling with? We want to have that annual plan for our audit, prioritizing the issues, again, by priority from that report and findings, and then develop a plan to the corrective actions and implementing your trainings for your staff and scheduling those follow-up audits. So having if we say it's January and we're going to conduct our audits every February, when do we start planning for our audit? Would it be September that we're thinking through when we put it on our calendar? All right, what do I need to do come February for my audit? What are my steps going to be? So building in our practice and our timing of when we start looking at that and putting it on our calendar. So that's where that action planning comes into play. And then here we have summary of Q&A and overall HR audits ensure compliance and operational excellence by helping us uncover those blind spots in our processes. They help us to become more proactive instead of reactive and to help reduce our risks and to enhance efficiencies. So I think this is a time, if we have questions and answers that we want to take advantage, that we certainly can do that now, and I'll do my best to answer questions.
Also, I'm going to jump in there a little bit, just to, yes, PowerPoint. I just kind of want to reiterate some of the great content that you had, Christy. SHRM did have, several studies that back to the metrics that you can save anywhere to 10 to 30% of your operating budget. And I saw a lot of people questioning about templates and the first stage that you had of the scope, and so much can fall under HR. So, and everybody's unique. So you really need to determine, what areas of HR that you're going to audit. So let's say that, you're a smaller company and you don't have training. So you're, probably not going to include training. But then sometimes I say, why not include training? Because then you'll show that you have no training. And is that something you need to address down the road type scenario? So those are kind of some just, feedback on that on the template. Also, I kind of encourage clients to look at it as a life cycle of an employee. And what's amazing is just when you think about how many tasks, and I think that's what we all kind of get hung up on is, oh, this is overwhelming. But if you say, okay, I need to hire a person, there's many of those tasks that are just, who writes the ad copy, where's the job description, are they exempt, non-exempt, all those things. And you'll really have a good idea if staff is doing duplicate information, if there's technology that can help you. So you kind of look at it from hiring and then onboarding, training, performance reviews, just kind of look at it as a big circle, kind of as a, life cycle of an employee. So that kind of, gives you a starting spot if people have never done an HR audit before. So I think I just mentioned it, but I just made a note that, that what I find in some of the audits that we've done is that a lot of people don't utilize the systems they already have. So you definitely want to include that in your audit. They kind of, forget about that. And then, when the report's done, just think it as a roadmap. You may not be able to get all your projects done, but maybe you set a strategic plan where, and especially in mergers and acquisitions, because I feel your pain there, is maybe that you just set smaller goals that we're just going to audit the hiring process. That's it, and then we're going to make, changes and implementations and, 90 days. These are the steps, pulling the project people to help you type scenario. Also, I think it's really important to set measurements, because then when you do the audit every year, you can see it. I mean, a lot of organizations don't even know what their turnover is, per department, per company. It's really important to know those measurements, and HR can be measured for sure. So that's really important.
And then I just am going to jump in. I totally agree with you. Like I said, what's measured is managed. And if you don't measure it, you're never going to manage it, because then you don't know what you need to manage. And, sometimes we think it's really, really difficult to build in. I always think of them as KPIs, and this comes from the food industry. We always had KPIs that we had to meet. And you can even build a metric for employee engagement. And like I said, with those roundtables, you're doing a roundtable and you target this many employees for each month that you're going to touch and have that two-way conversation with. Are we meeting all employees over the year? Each month, are we meeting our targets? That becomes an employee engagement metric that you can easily build. So it's just getting creative with how we do it.
Yeah, great. We do have a question, Christy. It says, what tips and considerations should be made for those who already participate in an ISO audit that includes the HR function?
Okay, so I've done ISO audits. I haven't done these for a little while, Rebecca, but I think it's really the building in your scope and objectives, and through your ISO audit, it's going to tell you what they going to hold you to reporting and giving your input. So making sure you're meeting the compliance for those areas, and then trying to get in front of it. And when I say that, meaning we may start off our first ISO audit is we're really behind in this. So then we're leaning into how do we start building that so we're not behind in our process. We know what they need. We're building it into our norms. We're building our regular audit items for that function, and we start managing it. Let's say if it's on a monthly basis, and this comes back to we're measuring where are we meeting those scope and objectives for our ISO audit, each area, right? That we build it in so it becomes easy and it makes it more natural for us to comply with what they're asking for in that audit. I hope that helps, and if it doesn't, I'm glad to interact one-on-one and try and get more detail.
Great. We have another question. It says, when it comes to the EEOC, who takes precedent, federal or state regulation?
Well, this one I think is harder because it's really going to depend on certain scenarios. Federal law typically may take precedence, but depending on state, it can be broader. States can enact additional protections beyond the federal law. So federal may say things like going to guide us on Title VII, civil rights, ADA, those basics. But then your state may come in and say, now we have to lean into marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity. Whereas the federal may not have it that specific. And so if one is more than the other, that's where the other is going to come into play where that is, and it becomes a catch. And some of this is too, do we meet the criteria of having the right numbers for Title VII, 15, plus employees, right? So it becomes more tricky, and we have to kind of look at them side by side. I hope that helps with your question, Melissa.
I was going to kind of just piggyback on that, Christy, and clarify. I mean, as long as I've been in HR, they always say if it's a federal and a state law and they may be in conflict or appear to be in conflict, whatever law most benefits the employee is the one that you should defer to. So a lot of people get, because states are more regulated now and have more compliance. Just an example is what's interesting is like an employee can, call the EEOC and make a complaint, and they can also call the state and make a complaint with their civil rights division.
Mhm.
But generally, you need to defer to what's most beneficial for the employee.
For the employee.
And before we get to another question, I'm sorry, I just want to say this is where with the change of everybody working virtually and you hiring employees in different states, and I know Christy had mentioned this, what we're running into, and this is part of the audit, is it's really, really important that your employee handbook is designed so it takes in that consideration of the different types, and especially there's a lot of different paid leave laws now in different states.
Mhm.
And so, if you first time you're hiring somebody from out of state, you really need to take that into consideration, because, when you get people in 10, 11 different states, it can get very complicated. So we're just seeing
and
now a lot.
I will say, and it even comes into play, with your payroll laws and things that maybe aren't true HR, but we can give guidance on. I've had someone who brought on an employee in South Carolina that actually resided in California, and they didn't realize that you have to put on your check stubs very compliant things per PAGA laws in California. And they were just treating them like they do a South Carolina employee. And you can't do that. You've got to make sure you're checking the boxes. If this person sits in that state, I'm abiding by what that state guideline is. And then again, updating handbook to meet that language for that employee.
Right. I have another question from Kevin Johnson. The EEO data was interesting, and was there a form of detail that contributed to the 5% increase?
You know, Kevin,
And
I
then he
don't,
said, go ahead.
I don't know what it was specifically. I just pulled up data and numbers, but I can see if I can find it again for you, and I'd be glad to share that with you.
Yeah, that would be interesting because it kind of flip-flops between, disability and, the different classifications. He did say my ask is to better connect the increase to a tangible and consistently audible
Audible.
HR metric. I can't say that word. Did I say it wrong?
It, it is one that it doesn't come off the tongue easily.
Yeah, and that makes sense, Kevin. It totally makes sense. So we'll get back to you on that. Great. And the only other thing I really have is really look at it as a roadmap. I know that it's overwhelming to spend time, to actually do the audit, but you will benefit greatly. And you just look at it as a roadmap. You can't do everything. You can't fix everything. You want to look at it maybe as like a stoplight, like the glaring ones you need to fix right away. The yellow ones, you need to get on them, but it's not urgent. And then, the green ones, obviously you're doing good. So, but you still want to continue to look at them. So that's kind of my last piece of advice. It's like I said in the beginning, it really is one of those kind of overlooked things that is really vital, especially in mergers and acquisitions. I understand the combining of several businesses together, but just look at it from a very small, micro level and then work up to the macro level kind of scenario. So do you guys have any more questions before we move on to the next slide? Questions? Great.
All right.
And go to the next slide, Christy.
Okay. Give me a second. It's working on it, Becky.
I know. Technology. Well, once again, I want to thank everybody for your time. And I want to literally just take 2 minutes to kind of just provide you a little more information on who we are and what we do. The JER HR Group's been in business for 35 years. We have over 40 professional consultants, and we just act as a partner to bring value to your organization. We collaborate with our clients, and we're customizable and effective solutions. So we have an HR division. We can help you with audits, recruitment, employee handbook, to name a few. We have a compensation division that's very robust, that starts with compensation philosophy all the way through pay structure, total reward strategies. This is something that really all organizations need to consider now. I'm sure it's one of your largest expenses in your budgets. And they're able to do it and make sure there's a focus on fair, legal, and competitive structure. We also have an organizational development division. It's called Nexa Learning, which offers leadership and management development, coaching, surveys, 360-degree feedback, things like that. And then I really want to talk about the technology, because people kind of brought it up in the in some of the comments. It's really vital. We have a division called Trainery One that is our talent management solution. And technology really does save you a ton of time and money. And we have 7 technologies that we work with throughout all our divisions. So somebody had mentioned trainings, and we have Track Learning, which is a technology solution that can actually track your trainings and, has it expired? When do they due up? Things like that. So that's kind of us in a nutshell. Again, I want to take and thank Tennessee SHRM. I hope everybody starts warming up soon. Christy, do you have anything else you want to contribute?
Well, I was just going to say, Sabrina came in with a question,
Oh,
so I was going to take an opportunity to try and give her a little response here. So in terms of legal standpoint, what you could potentially reference, you're going to have different federal and state regulations. So you want to look at things like potentially your federalregister.gov. you're going to look at your state specific legal codes. And so each state typically will have a website that you can use to try and gather information and data. If it's potentially industry specific and could be IRS, could be OSHA, just kind of depends on what industry you're in. I know earlier we talked about the ISO audit, so depending on if you're in the food manufacturing, you may have different things you're held to. There are legal tools and databases out there that you can use, and of course, you can also lean into JER-HR. We'd be glad to help. Or there's legal assistance out there with labor law attorneys, employment and compliance consultants as well. So just trying to give you some resources, and if you have more specific questions, certainly reach out. I'd be glad to talk more about that.
Great, and we'll just go to our last slide, Christy.
Okay.
So should you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information, you're gonna get, once again, you're gonna get everything in an email. And if not, you can just simply email us at info@jerhrgroup.com. We know your time is valuable. We really appreciate your time, and we want to say, thank you very much for attending today. And, check for upcoming webinars, and thank you very much, and have a great, wonderful rest of your day. Oh, everybody leaving, just saying thank you. Make sure I'm not missing questions. Yep.
Yeah, it looks like it's just
Awesome.
thank you. Appreciate everybody joining today.
Thank you.